Hey everyone, welcome back to Old World Legends. I'm your host Mike, and with me as always I have Evan.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here and definitely not being held against my will.
Well, I can't promise that. But anyway, today in this episode, we're going to continue our onboarding series, in particular, helping out hopefully a growing community of newer players who want to dive further into the game and just need a helping hand to get started. Because let's face it, it's a lot to take in. It's exciting, it's thrilling, but it's definitely great to have some advice of people who have been there and have done this a few times. So in a previous episode, Evan, right, we talked about how do you get started in terms of picking an army. So that was
Mhm.
really fun. We went through some of the pros and cons and some of our recommendations of a healthy, what we think is a healthy process to select something you're excited about, you're passionate about, and not be so driven by the internet or the community or focus too much on what's hot in the meta right now, but more about what are you going to be, love to play a year from now, 2 years from now, especially after you put so much energy into your army. But let's say you bought some models, Evan. You were excited by maybe Bretonian, perhaps, in that amazing starter box. Well, now that you've picked up some models, you've assembled them. What's the next, or maybe even before you've assembled them? What's the next step for someone who wants to get into the game?
Well, I think what a lot of people do is they're like, should I put, spears on my infantry? Should I put halberds? What do I do? Oh, I know. I'll go to the Reddit and I'll post there and just ask for help. And this is a problem because there's a lot of different ways people respond to these posts. Half of them say, do whatever you think looks cool. Just go ahead and be free and be happy, which isn't anything in terms of information for them to get going. That's not really what they're looking for. Or the other half of the people are saying the current competitive meta is to play, with this specific magic item that you haven't heard of yet, and then that's just too much information. So it's very much not anything in the middle.
Yeah. So now we will do another episode where we will talk specifically about assembling your models and building your army and some kind of tips to go about doing that and what does WYSIWYG mean and other phrases like that. But in this episode, there's a step typically before you actually build your models. Again, some people like to dive in right away and do the list building separate, but that's where we're going to focus on this step today. So you've picked up some models, you picked an army that you were excited about.
Mm-hmm.
You've hopefully got your hands on the core rulebook. You probably glanced through it a little bit. Maybe you had the gumption to read through it once a whole time. You probably understood half of it, maybe at best, because you haven't played games yet.
Yeah.
Because really, that is the best way to learn. Is you need to play a game and in a friendly environment, and nothing's going to beat experience. But before then you need to put a list together in order to get that experience. So that's the main thing is all armies start with an agreement. Hey Evan, let's play a game of Warhammer the Old World together. Awesome, let's do it. We arrange a time, we figure something out, because again it's a social game, right? So you figure out with your friends or someone at the local gaming store or your community that you're going to play with, and then the next thing you decide is how many points,
Yeah.
right? So that's the next thing, right? Is how many points. You're like, well, what do you mean points? It's like, well, to every army, you decide as the player, this is the types of things I'm going to bring in my army. I like this character. I have this, war machine, or I have this cavalry unit, etc. And everything that you bring um, is calculated out through a point system. That's how the game is generally balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And so now the typical point style right now for the old world is 2,000 points for a typical event game. You can play lower points values, especially as you're building up your army, which is totally valid, and you can play higher points value. The system is fairly flexible, but the
Yeah.
the average is 2,000 in terms of that's typically where almost any event or community is building around. There are some exceptions to that, but Evan, what would be some good examples where we would want to play with lower points, and what's kind of the lowest threshold where it still feels like the game, and at what point does it start to not feel like the game if we go
Well,
too
it,
low?
it depends a little bit. So first of all, the thing that a lot of new people will want to do is to buy their start collecting army box and just play with the
Mm-hmm.
models that come in that one box. And one of the things that Old World has launched with that's very successful in my mind at bringing in new people is that most of these big boxes that when you buy them, that is actually plenty to play with. So if you've got
Mm-hmm.
the 30 orcs and the 40 goblins with two chariots, that's plenty. If you've got the Pegasus Knights with the Knights of the Realm and then some peasants on foot, that's plenty. So if you just buy that one box, you can put together about 1,000 points, around 1,200 for like the Tomb Kings and Bretonnia lists, You
Yeah, it
could
just
put,
depends
yeah,
on the box for sure.
yes, for sure. So I think that depending on what you equip your orc boys with, the orc one can be as low as like 400 points. But
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
but that's what
there
we're
are
gonna
always
get into.
exceptions.
Yeah,
So let's talk about 1,000 points. We mentioned that. So, like I said, generally you are building towards a 2,000 points. Again, you can play higher or lower, but most events, most communities will be playing around 2,000 points. This is also a very standard point threshold for other Games Workshop games, such as Warhammer 40,000 and such. So there is definitely some consistency of generally they point out and balance their games around a typical army, if you will, is around that 2,000 point threshold. There's
mm-hmm.
not a right or wrong answer to that. That's just the way that the game has evolved over the years. So with the 2,000 points, now you can play fewer points than that, and somebody might go, well, I just really like this one box. It's not even a starter box. I just really like this cavalry unit, and you're going
Yeah,
to find you're far off from even a lower threshold. And my experience, I don't know what your Evan has been, is that when you start looking at the points values, you see that 1,000 points, even for an intro game, is about as low as you want to go because it still feels like Warhammer: The Old World at 1,000 points when you're playing it. It feels like once you start getting less than 1,000 points, some of the rules or interactions you're hoping to get the back and forth start to break apart. So you can play lower points games. You can construct army lists of a 500 point army list, but you're going to find you don't have a lot of units, and it doesn't feel like a war game at that point.
yeah, yeah, and like the book says, you have to have at least 3 units that are non-characters and non-war beasts or swarms. So you need to have, for example, a unit of knights, some archers, and then, maybe at least one other thing, like a chariot or some flying cavalry or a
Something.
catapult, for example. Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, so that's definitely there. And again, there are definitely some communities out there, though, or players who love to go above 2,000 points. They love to go to 2,500 is a common number. And some of the older editions, a lot of the events were based around 2,500 points. Some groups will want to go up to 3,000, and that's great. That's awesome. There's pros and cons with that. One great thing about going higher is, hey, you get to field a bigger army. This looks really cool. Look at my art field forces in front of me. It
mm,
looks beautiful on the table. It's fantastic. Part of the cons though is it's going to take you longer to play that game. Because there's a
yeah,
lot more units on the table. So all of a sudden you were trying to, play the game in 3 hours or under. All of a sudden you're like, ooh, it's been 5 hours and we're only on turn four, right? So the more units, the longer the game is going to take. And then there's more to assemble, and there's more things you'd have to buy too, right? So it's not as approachable for those higher thresholds. But it's great once you have your first collection. Some people just, what, this is the army for me. I love this army. I love playing it. I love painting it. I love hobbying it. I'm just going to keep getting more of this faction because it really speaks to me, and I love collecting it, right? And so
right,
it's very common to go well above 2,000 points in terms of models you have of paint. But
right.
some people, Evan, like yourself, like to have a lot of different factions, right? And it's fun for some people to jump around once you have a large set. So how
Yeah,
many are
I
you up to
have
now?
9 of them.
Which is very cool. So again, there is no wrong answer here, really. But again, our biggest recommendation is play the game. Play the
Yeah,
game, get models on the table, get involved with the community because that's the best way to learn and that's the best way to get motivated. But we need to start with let's talk about kind of the steps to building that army list because the army list will help inform you what do you need to assemble and perhaps what do you need to buy next or add to your collection. And it's really great to look at it from, hey, if I start with 1,000 points, cool. Well, this is what my army would look like if I got to 1,250. This is what my army would look like if I got to
yeah,
1,500 as you step your way up to 2,000. Some people will just go, bam, I'm all in and I'm going to buy 2,000 points all at once. I highly recommend you play some games first. Play
yeah,
some games because you're going to learn. It's not just, you're going to learn what you like and don't like, and your opinions of units will change based upon playing. That's the best way. So, Evan, why don't we load up the Forces of Fantasy to start with?
yep,
So,
yep.
um, now the old world launched with some actual army lists to begin with. So, can you walk us through, Evan? What did they start with in terms of, all right, I have the core book, I have my starter box. I in this case we picked. You got excited, Evan, by Bretonians, but what do you do next to build a list? What do you need to find?
Well, yeah, so I think some people did actually miss this, and it's not super obvious, especially compared to the other Games Workshop games. But there are
Mhm.
2 army books, and each of these books, The Forces of Fantasy and The Ravening Hordes, has 5 and 4, respectively, armies in it. So there is
Hmm.
no Bretonia, army book. There is no Beastman army book. These get to have multiple army lists all wrapped into one. And one of the cool things about that is that it kind of gives you the option to go and look at to see what the other people's rules are. If you play, AOS or 40K, you might not actually know what the other people's rules are unless if you leaf through some of those books or buy all 20 of the army books every edition. And so this is a great way to keep everyone up to date on what the rules actually are, which is amazing. But
Yeah,
this is where you're going to
and we
find
don't
your,
know.
yeah.
We don't know if they're going to keep doing that in the future because the typical pattern is when they will release Games Workshop a new edition of a game, whether it's hopefully at some point in the future edition 2 of the old world, or you see it in AOS and 40K. Every book is a standalone army book by itself. But because again, the old world edition 1, this is a test, this is a beta. Hey, if we bring back this game from the past, will it resonate with people? Yes, it absolutely resonates with people. So they didn't release all the art faction books individually, and some of the older books from Warhammer Fantasy, older editions, you would find all the army books individually. Here's just the Bretonia book. Here's just the Tomb King book, and they'd have a lot more pictures and a lot more lore and different things. So these are really condensed versions where it has all the rules
Mm-hmm.
and unit info for each army. Basically it's the good guy book and the bad guy book is basically what it is for the core factions.
That
And then
offends
there's a
the Tomb Kings
little bit
players a
of lore.
lot if you say it that way. Because the Tomb
Well,
Kings
you
players
know
don't see
what?
themselves as evil, okay?
Well, some evil factions see themselves as evil, some see themselves as good. It's in the eye of the beholder, that's for sure. Um, but that's basically what these two books are. And then the legacy factions weren't in these books. So, Evan, how do they find if they were interested in a legacy faction, how do they find those rules?
Well, so the legacy factions, so that would be the Dark Elves, the Chaos Dwarves, the Vampire Counts. These are all found as the PDFs on the Warhammer Community website. So if you Google, Vampire Counts, the Old World Rules, the first link that will come up will be a PDF download. It's similar to the one that we're looking at here, but instead of it being all five of these armies in one, it's just the one legacy list. And what's cool about that is you always have access to the PDF, and in theory, as happened a few times, Games Workshop can update those PDF rules with balance changes or clarifications.
Yeah, so it's really cool. So while for the Forces of Fantasy, the good guy book, or the Ravening Hordes, the bad guy faction books, right? So the good guys, there was it five good and good guys in the Forces of Fantasy, and
Yeah,
four bad guys in the core, right? 'Cause there's nine
yeah,
in the core, and then the legacy is was it seven?
seven.
Legacy? Seven, thank you. So those are individual. Now you can get digital versions of this book. You can buy the physical book, Forces of Fantasy, all together, or the physical Bad Guy book, Raving Hordes, all together. Or you can download from the Games Workshop sites the digital PDF versions like we're viewing right here. So
Yeah,
both are available based upon your preference. There is no wrong answer. I end up typically buying both because I love holding the book. I love reading the book. I love sitting down or reading it in bed or in front of, on the couch. I also like the digital versions for going to events and things. It's just less to carry and it's easier to search. So there's no wrong answer. It's just preference, and some people like both. Just depends on your preference. So this is what the book would look like in terms of digital version. But let's jump to Bretonian. Let's not make this segment too long. Let's put a list together. How do we do that? All right.
yeah. So for each army, you
So
have an army
Evan,
list, right?
Grand Army.
Yeah.
Tell us what a Grand Army composition is.
So the Grand Army composition is essentially your starter main, released army composition. This is telling you how do you build an army for Bretonia in the default fashion. The Arcane Journal came out with two other ways to play that will be expanded upon when we start talking about Bretonia more specifically. But for every, almost every faction, you essentially just have a Grand Army composition list. And what it's doing is it's breaking down how you can spend your points on characters, what their specific limitations are. For example, Baron or Prophetess per 1,000 points. And then it talks about which units end up in a core slot or a special slot or a rare slot. So when you have a box of models in front of you, what you do is you convert those into a roster where you're saying these peasants, these guys are going to be yeomen on foot and they've got halberds or whatever, and that's what turns models into an army list.
So let's back that up a little bit.
Yeah.
That was a lot of information if you haven't built an army before. If you've played 40K or AOS or other Games Workshop games, you're going to be very familiar with this. But if you're new to tabletop gaming or Games Workshop tabletop gaming, you might not be as familiar. So earlier we said, hey, we're going to play a game and we're trying to build towards a 2,000 point roster. And we said, hey, go ahead and spend your points. Well, Well, now you're saying there's a composition. I can't just spend 2,000 points however I want. So you mentioned something like core, Evan. You mentioned rare. So
Hmm.
take us through these categories
Yeah.
and how does that work with me deciding how to spend points? And is that the same for every army, or is it different per army, or how does that work? So let's walk somebody through the fundamentals.
Okay, so to start with, every army has at least one character who will be your general. In the book, it kind of writes it down that your general is kind of like you. It's your kind of avatar on the battlefield. That's
Hmm.
how it should be. And then it breaks down here in characters which characters those can be. So there's often basically melee fighting characters who are like the dukes or the barons, who are capable of dealing damage in close combat, and they have more of those combat stats. And then there are
We could probably
characters like,
zoom in on this so we can see the categories better.
all right, let's
I know
do
I'm putting them on the fly, seeing if he can zoom in. Oh, there we go.
too much.
Okay, there we go. So hopefully you can read that. So again, some of these general
Yeah,
concepts, like Evan just said, like you have to have a general. These are found in the core rulebook, right?
yeah,
So there are some rules for building an army that every army has to follow, such as there must be a general. But then, in terms of constructing, we said let's play 2,000 point game. In this case, Evan chose Bretonians. He's going to play that, so he found his army composition. This is how you build a Bretonian army in the Good Guy book, the Forces of Fantasy book. And now he's walking us through the categories because apparently you can't just spend the points on anything you want. There is a way to build the army properly because the purpose of this is the designers of the game want it to feel and look like an army on the tabletop, right? So they've really constructed it in certain ways to make it feel and look like that army. And so you have to work within these rules. So you walked us through some character stuff. Let's keep going, Evan.
yeah. So the difference between a model who's a knight who is a member of a squad of Knights of the Realm in the core unit slot and a knight who is a character is first of all whether you gave them a funny name in your little army list, which you don't have to do. But it's basically represented in their stats. So if you have that first start collecting box with the Bretonians in it, you can just take one of your knights that has a little lance and you can say, you know what, this guy, he's going to count as my paladin for this game, and that's the difference. So what they count as when they're on the table, right? So a character is a kind of a lone model that runs around and has its own individual items. Now he can usually join units or move around by themselves. And units are always ranked up and kept together for the most part, and then they are joined by characters and buffed, and that they form the other half of the army.
So we could talk about characters for a little bit. So
Yeah,
character in this particular army, right? These are your heroes, right? These are your general or your wizard, right? Or your priest or whatever it might be. These are the hero type characters who either they could be a special character that have a specific name already, or you might want to name them yourself, as Evan was saying, right? So in this army, in the Bretonian army, it could be a duke, right? Or it could be a baron or a prophetess. It lists them out here. It tells you these are the character, the hero level things you could take, or paladin, so forth and so on. Versus if we were looking at a vampire count's army, they would have different heroes. It would be a vampire, or it would be a white king, or a necromancer. These are hero level. They're characters. They're a category of their own. And you can't just spend 2,000 points on characters, can you? Because characters are very, very powerful. And sometimes, often, they're the most powerful pieces you have. Like if you're playing chess, it's the queen. These are the most powerful pieces you have in your army roster. But there's a restriction on those. What's the restriction, Evan?
well, so in almost every book, we have up to 50% of your army's points can be spent on characters. So if you were to play an intro game of a 1,000 points, then you would spend up to 500 points on characters. And surprisingly, there are some characters in the game that can be valued at over 500 points individually. You could have
Mm-hmm.
just one character it cost more than that sometimes.
Yes, you can, especially if you put them on a dragon and give them a whole bunch of magic items. So that's the main thing about characters. Those are your hero levels. Those are some of your most powerful pieces you have in your army. It's fun to give them names. They're great, but you can't just take a whole army of characters. So you have to lead an army. That's the point of them. They're here to lead your army into battle. So now that and again, you don't have to spend 50% of your points on characters, but you have to at least have a general. Different armies will have some different restrictions. We're not going to go into those because that's army by army. If they have specific requirements or restrictions, it will tell you here on your grand army composition list. It will tell you this is what you have to follow. But then you have core. Core. What is the core of an army, and what? How do typically the restrictions for or requirements you need to have for core? Because they're not going to be the same as characters, are they?
No, no. In fact, so in most armies, you essentially have a list of core units that you need to spend at least 25% of your army's points values on. So again, if we did the 1,000 point intro game example, that would be 250 points. But in
Hmm.
some cases, like in the case of Bretonia, they also have a limit where you have to take 1 plus, which means 1 or more units of specific categories. So in the Bretonia example, it's 1 plus units of Knights of the Realm, either mounted or on foot, and 1 plus units
Hmm.
of men at arms. Now, the reason for this is to give you that kind of lore friendly vibe of you. Bretonian armies always have at least some knights in them, and they always have at least some
Yep.
peasants in them.
Yep. So you're going to get that theme and that flavor. So while characters, they had that upper limit. You can't spend more than 50% of your army on characters. Core were almost flipped. It's saying you have to spend a minimum of 25% on core units, right? So as Evan said, 1,000 points, that's 250. 2,000 points would be 500, etc. And there was also another requirement of having to take that Knights of the Realm. And again, some armies will not have core specific unit requirements. Some army will. You need to read the army composition because again it's not only trying to make sure you're fielding something on the table that looks and plays like an army but looks and plays in this case like a Bretonian army, right? That's the kingdom of Bretonia is what you're fielding here. So that's what core are. Now core are typically your rank and file, if you will, the mass troops of the army, the faction that represents them, that you have access to them. So if you wanted to spend, just take your one general character and then you wanted to spend the rest of your points on core, you absolutely could. Might not be as effective on the tabletop as you would like, which is why there are rare, special, and rare. And effectively, the higher you go up in that hierarchy, typically the more powerful those units are, and more effective they are for their points cost, which is why you'll find that there's more restrictions the further we go up. So that's the difference between them. So we talked about core as this is, some people will refer to it as your tax because they have to take it, right? No matter what. But again, core units can be very, very effective. You're building an army and you learn when you play the game. Not everything in your army is going to be the hammer, right? Some things need to be the anvil. Some things need to take the punch. Some things need to redirect units. Some things need to get in the way. Some things need to be utility, right? Think about any great fantasy movie or medieval movie you've watched, whether it's Braveheart, Excalibur, or something else. There's always the extra scouts or ambushers or vanguarding or rank and file units that are critical to the success of the battle, even if they're not performing the killing blow. And that's how you should be viewing your core. They are critical to your success, even if they're not the thing doing the killing.
Yes,
All right. So special. What's special, Evan?
everything about them is special. Special units are essentially it's very much a vibes based differentiation, and that's why you often see units of that are in special slot occasionally be allowed as a 0 to 1 option in the core choice, because they represent the more rare, the more elite units in this kind of roster, and they take up to 50%. Now this isn't really that much of a cap because you have to have 25% of core, and you're going to have at least
Mm-hmm.
some characters. But generally speaking, it's that you can then bring all these other units. So for Bretonia, you have the Questing Knights, the Pegasus Knights. These are your more elite cavalry, for flying cavalry in some sense. And then the
Mm-hmm.
Battle Pilgrims being those kind of fanatical zealots with like a stick.
Definitely fanatics. So
Yes.
when we switched to core, it was you must take this many. Now special, we flip back to a restriction. It
Yes.
says you can only take up to 50% again of your whole army in special. And the special units, in almost all cases, will be more elite versions of core units. They're more efficient. They can do more things. That doesn't necessarily mean they're more killy. They could be better at scouting. They could be better at some utility.
Mm-hmm.
Being more efficient or effective could mean a lot of different things, or they could be getting in the way. And there's typically more restrictions on them as well, such as with the battle pilgrims with Bretonian. There's beyond just they're special and you can only take so many points of them. There's an additional you can only take this many units per 1,000 points you have in your roster. So you will see more and more of these as we go up the list. So that's really the difference between core and special. Some armies you will absolutely see tons of special units taken. Pegasus Knights for Bretonian, people take them in most army rosters, right? But some other armies that won't take nearly as many special units, right? So again, it really is based upon the army and what's exciting to you, right? You might say, well, Pegasus Knights are cool and all, but you know what? I just love the Questing Knight models, right? And you want to find versions of the build of your army because you want to paint up and hobby these models, and you're going to look for other ways to build your list, right? So We went through core, we went through special. Let's talk about rare.
So rare is essentially the most elite of the units that are still, non-characters. These are, the most special units, the units that are supposed to be a pretty uncommon sight on the battlefield. And to represent that, you
Mm-hmm.
have a very limited number of percentage of your points to spend on them. In the Bretonni's case, these are the Grail Knights, who are the most elite of the knights. These guys had to go on a Grail quest. They had to, literally like bring the bathwater back to the Lady of the Lake.
Yeah, they had to find the Holy Grail. That's a heck of a quest. They're very, and
They
they're
are
definitely
living
a lot more
saints.
punchy.
Yes,
Yep,
they
pretty much. They're
yes.
amazing.
So they are essentially one hair away from being like I'm a character, and you have a whole squad of these
Yes,
dudes. These guys are like the Avengers, right? And so
they hit
that's why
hard.
they're the rarest. Um, and similarly, you have
Yeah,
field trebuchets. They're so sometimes it's a rare unit, not necessarily because they're very special in the lore. It's just because they don't represent a large portion of the army. You don't have these big artillery trained Bretonnian armies. These are just kind of tacked on as a support piece.
yeah. So you'll see different reasons of sometimes it is the most powerful units you can take are in rare. That's why they're in rare because they're the most powerful. Sometimes they're in rare because thematically there would only be so many of them available, right? There's only so many knights who can find the Holy Grail and bring it back, right? It's not a very common thing, right? Or the example of the trebuchet, right? It's not a big lore thing. It's just the designers of the game built that their view of this army is a bunch of knights on the table and peasants. It's not a whole bunch of war machines, but they do have access to some war machines, right? So there's different reasons why something will be in rare. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most powerful thing. But that's kind of the core of the army in terms of the pillars, your characters, your core, your special, your rare. But then we also have mercenaries and allies. So Evan, talk to us a little bit about that. Now, again, this will be different from army to army, but there are some general principles that will be applicable to pretty much every army.
So, mercenaries, first off, are kind of an ever expanding list of unit types that are generally available to pretty much everyone. Currently, I think the
Mm-hmm.
only ones the Bretonians could take would be the Badlands Ogre Bulls. So, they're specific ogres that are kind of mercenaries who will just fight for anyone. And the idea behind this is that then anyone's army could potentially be expanded with more universal set of units.
Now, am I going to find all the mercenaries that my Bretonian army can take in my Forces of Fantasy PDF in front of me?
Oh no.
No. Okay, so that's important to know. Like, well, wait a second, at least mercenaries here. And when they released this, all the armies listed mercenaries as an option, but you're like, well, where are they? There
Yeah.
weren't any mercenaries, and I think Evan was just mentioning it there. This is a great category where the design team can release individual units by themselves or characters to expand the game and the roster. A lot of armies can take as mercenaries. Some are very restricted. Those mercenaries, they could be potentially in their magazine, their White Dwarf magazine. We haven't seen that yet, but we know they've done that in the past. It's possible they do that in the future. We have seen mercenaries appear in some of the arcane journals, right? We've seen some of those. Have they? Did they post some on the community as a download as well, or I forget,
They
or has it
post
just been
about
arcane
them
journals?
to kind of announce that they're a thing, but essentially
Yeah,
the mercenary rules have come out as part of an arcane journal, and then the arcane journal might be, for example, for Badland Ogre Bulls, it was an arcane journal for orcs and goblins, but that book
right.
contained the rules for the Badland Ogre Bulls, and then it said, one unit of Badland Ogre Bulls can be taken as mercenaries in any of the Forces of Fantasy or the Ravening Horde's army books, or something of
There you
that
go.
nature, and then it gives you a list of who can take them. Another good example is, for example, that the dwarf Doomseekers, when they were released as the dwarf arcane journal, it said in there
Yep.
that they can be taken as an empire mercenary. So in this way,
Very
you might
cool.
even get something for your army when other arcane journals are releasing, and kind of keeping everything fresh.
Yeah, which is really exciting. So you can go and look at all the other arcane journals, but again, I'd also encourage you to just join your local community, or you're welcome to join the Old World Legends Discord, join our community, and just ask people in the Discord. They'd be happy to talk to you about Old World all day long, just as we are, and happy to point you in the right direction. So that's mercenaries, and again, there are typical restrictions on that. The core rulebook does have additional details about how mercenaries behave. We're not going to cover that here, but you should look those up because they're not super shockingly. A mercenary is not as reliable as your core Grand Army entries, so you should look those up. before you get too excited about taking mercenaries. There are some pros and cons to taking them, but they are definitely exciting, and there are definitely some really great mercenaries out there that you should strongly consider, and really cool models. But we
Yes.
also have allies. But allies are not as beloved in the event scene, Evan. So talk to us about allies.
So just to bridge that gap, my first game of playing Warhammer Fantasy in I believe something around 2007 was
Hmm.
in a Games Workshop store because it used to be called that, and I
Yep.
didn't have 2,000 points of Empire or 2,000 points of Orcs and Goblins. I had some starter set that had both of those two armies in it, and so in order to
Yep.
play with someone who was at the store, I had to combine them together and use them as an allied force. I had Orcs and Goblins running next to my Empire troops, and I played against a Wood Elf player who destroyed me. That was my first experience. So if you lose your first game, you're among friends.
Yep.
um,
Well, as almost everybody does. But I think
yes.
that's the purpose of allies to keep in mind. There's pros and cons on allies, right? As one of the pros Evan just mentioned is taking allies is a great way of cobbling together different units from different factions to really help new players who are just starting to build out their collection, right? And to try new things. So it's really great for that. It's great for accessibility and for onboarding. It's also great for, just, you know what? I really love the Bretonian army, but you know what? Let me look at this. Oh, the high elves. I really love the high elves too. Like I just would really want to take one of this chariot unit or something else from them because I just think they're the coolest thing ever. I'm not ready to do a whole high elf army, but I'd love the idea of combining the forces. And I love that the rules let you do that, which is great. It just really opens up the armies and the compositions and the sets. So that's a lot of great stuff there, and great for narrative games and casual games and games for friends. They're fantastic about that. But on the downside, if you're going to an event, um, each army, the way it's designed, has the things an army is very good at, and things that army is okay at, and the things that an army is bad at. Right? You noticed in this Bretonian list there was some shooting, some trebuchets, and some peasant bowmen. Not a lot of other shooting, right? So clearly, the Bretonian, this Grand Army list, does not excel at shooting. Well, you can very quickly with allies end up taking units that overcome or get around, support the negative thing, the hole that the faction you're playing has. You can take allies that can plug that hole, so suddenly your army doesn't have any weaknesses. Now, taking allies, there's a little bit more to it than that, but generally speaking, this is why in terms of when going to events, you will find most events are not currently supporting bringing allies. They are with mercenaries, which feel very balanced and fair and reasonable, and everyone's very supportive of that. But you're going to
Yeah.
find less at going to events, whether if it's a casual event like our overall events, or a lot more experience based and casual based, or more competitive events. Generally speaking, people are frowned upon currently for taking allies at those events, but great for trying things out, great for casual games, fun for at home or league games. Just talk to your local community and see what their take on it, because some communities are like, yeah, we love allies, absolutely, and then some are like, no, we'd rather you didn't take those. So just make sure you're talking to the people, just as Evan and I were saying, hey, let's play an intro game, and he took Bretonia and I took something else. We said, let's play 2,000 points. Clarify with your, oh, are we going to use allies? And just have that conversation beforehand.
Absolutely.
Cool. And then it lists out here what allies you can take, right? And again, that will be different
Yes.
from army to army. They're all very different. So there's a lot of allies here I see that the Bretonians could take, which is cool. I can tell you for one of my favorite armies, the Vampire Counts, they have one.
Yeah.
It's just Tomb Kings, right? So it's going to be different
Yeah.
from army to army.
One of the worst parts about the Allies rules at the moment is that the core 9 armies only list allies from the other core 9 armies,
Yep.
whereas so they're not listing any of the legacy
Legacy.
factions in any of these lists. So the Bretonians can't call upon the Ogre Kingdoms as allies, for example, even if that was a thing that should make sense.
Hmm.
And this, so that's another reason why people maybe shy away from using the allies rules, because if you were to use them out of the box, any of the core main factions can't do the things that the legacy factions would be able to. Whereas, yeah, like you said, the vampire counts can ally with the Tomb Kings.
Yep. So it's a little weird. So it's something to keep in mind. And again, similar to the mercenary rules, there are more restrictions for how to take allies, and that those are listed out in the main core rulebook. We're not going to go over them here today.
Okay.
Cool. So basically, you go through this. So let's not go through the whole roster, but just let's just look at one a character, Evan, for an example. Let's just look at what does it list for points, right? Because we've never built a roster. So first thing you typically want to do, let's okay, Lord of Bretonia. Let's start there. So you opened up your starter box and you found a awesome Duke model on a Pegasus. So walk us through, Evan. How would you field in your roster? And let's even start before that. Where do you build your roster? Are you doing this on pen and paper? Or are you making your army roster on a napkin or writing it on the back of your hand? Or what are you going to do?
I'm probably using Notepad++. Just kidding. Now, there's multiple apps out there. I think that New Recruit is one option. They have some
That's a
free
good one.
options, but
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a subscribe tier. And then the other option that's completely free is the Old World Builder, which is an app. It uses kind of your cookies to save your list, so you don't have to create a username and account to log into it
Mm-hmm.
to get started.
And these are
Um,
both apps
yep.
online, right? They're you can use them both for free. I know
Yeah.
I do. You can. There are subscription if you want better versions of them. So back in the day, people would pen and paper write out
Hmm.
your army list is how you'd have to do that. And I'm so sure everybody always got their math perfectly right. I'm sure people never made mistakes. Yeah, right. Then at some point, everyone started switching to Excel and did it in Excel. What's amazing in the current day and age that there's these awesome people out there who make these apps not just for the old world. They make these army building apps for many game systems, and then they support old world as one of the game systems that you can build a roster in. Because many other game systems, whether they're Games Workshop or others, use points-based systems and army composition systems. That's very common in tabletop gaming. So they will. There's a great these great apps. In fact, you could just use them on your phone or on the website on the computer. You just go to the websites. Again, hit us up. You could find them very easily with the Google search and log in, and then they have them all as drop downs. So you don't have to memorize the points here or what's in the book. You actually, after you've done this a few times, building a few army rosters, you kind of just build them in the app, and you don't have to keep referencing your PDF anymore because they have all the information in it. It's fantastic that people have done this for free in the community. They've clearly put a ton of time to make this way more accessible and way easier for you as a player. And then once you're playing the game, Evan and I are going to go. He's going to come over to my place. We're going to hang out. I'm going to bring my army. He's going to bring his. We could just load up the app, the website or the app, and have our roster in front of us. So that's where you would typically be doing this. But right now, so we start with general. Evan has his Duke. So how would you go about kitting out or adding a Duke to your army roster?
Well, just to point out real fast, you have a character who's on a royal Pegasus, but that could
Mm-hmm.
be a paladin or a baron
Ah,
or a duke
ah.
because that one model can represent whatever level of character you want to play. A lot of people like the idea of I'm going to start my character out as a paladin, and after a couple intro games, he's going to be leveled up to a baron, perhaps get a new
Now, how would I
item,
know that
something
as
like
a new
that.
player? Like I just
Yeah,
have this model and the box says Duke of Bretonia on it.
exactly.
So how do you know that, Evan?
Well, basically, you
I,
got this one listing here. So the listing says Lords of Bretonia, and then there's these different
oh,
levels. They generally list the highest level first, and then kind of the lower levels as you go down. There's often only two levels, kind of like a hero level, what people will call, and then a lord level because they're referencing the more archaic form of the different character tiers from previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy. But in these editions, it's much more fluid, and the main difference is essentially like how many wounds they have, how many attacks they can do, how many points they cost,
okay.
and also how much magic items they can buy.
Do I have to paint him differently or assemble him differently, or can I just make the badass model and then when I make a list, I just decide which of these entries I want to use?
Yes, precisely. You make the badass model exactly the way you want. In fact, if you want to give him a funny sword, or if you want to go clip off a marauder flail and glue that onto his hand instead, you go for it. Because in fantasy, we don't need the model's actual weapon to match precisely with what he's trying to equip with. So if you wanted to give this character the Dragon Slayer sword, you could model him with an axe, you could model him with a lance. That's perfectly acceptable, and you don't need to be changing what it looks like just to give a different item.
Yep, all you need to do, and again, we'll talk more about this in the hobby episode, and this is where the WYSIWYG comes back in. This is the old school saying of what you see is what you get, WYSIWYG, that because there are so many options and permutations, because one of the amazing things and really fun things about old world and building an army is there's options. There's loads of options in terms of weapons, shields, gear, armor, equipment, magic items, talismans. You can't make 30 versions of this model. So you just make the one badass model, the Duke on the Pegasus, and you paint him the way you want. If you want a lance in his hand, you put a lance in his hand. You want a sword in his hand, you put a sword in his hand. That's fine. It's not a problem. And then you get him out here, and Evan's going to walk us through. He's going to cut out a character for us. And then once at the beginning of the game, Evan showing up to the battle, we go through this what we call the muster phase, where he walks me through what his army list is, and he says, "Oh, and here's my Duke model, and I know he's." Has a lance because I modeled him with a lance because it looks really cool because it's awesome. But it's like he's actually using the ogre blade magic item. Oh, okay, he told me. I understand that now. So we're all in agreement. Not a problem. Cool rule of cool. Make sure it's a model you love and are passionate about. Just tell your opponent any kit differences and how you kitted them out, and you're good to go.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right. So
precisely.
you have your model. You have your cool character on a Pegasus. What do you do next?
So I think the first place to start is really just what kind of weapon they're going to be equipped with. Particularly for Lords of Bretonnia, these are very melee focused characters. You can see they
Well,
have a
how are you
ballistic
deciding
skill.
which tier to pick them with, though?
That's a
How did
good
you make
point.
that
So
decision?
maybe your points value would be a good bet there. So if you have a 1,000 point army, I'd say probably a Baron would be a good general at that point, because if you take the Duke, he might be in up to 400 points by the time you're done buying all the stuff you want,
So
and
remember our
that
points
yeah,
restrictions above, right? So the
exactly.
size of your game will determine should you get the more expensive character? He is better in every way, except he costs more points. And if you're playing 1,000 points, it's you get like, oh, do I want to spend that many points in this character? Maybe you won't be able to afford another character, right? So you as the general playing this game are deciding how many points you want to invest into this one character. It will make him better, but you're putting more eggs in that basket, right? And so if the opponent kills him, you're going to lose more points because he's worth more, right? So you have to make that pros and cons decision there.
Exactly. So let's
All
say
right, so
you
we're playing a
picked Baron,
2,000 point,
right?
Evan. Okay, you want to go with the Baron? Let's go with the
Well,
Baron.
see, at 2,000 points, you changed my mind.
Ah, okay. So if we were playing 2,000 points, what would you pick instead?
Uh, Basically, you definitely pick the Duke at the 2,000 point level. You have
Okay.
a lot more magic item allotment. You have got weapon skill 7. That's a big upgrade. So when you're at a kind of what we call a full size army level, I think the Duke is your general. He is the best bet, and you get to
Okay.
customize him in many different ways. So
So we're playing 2,000 points. You go
yeah,
with the Duke. That's
yeah,
175 to start with. You see it tells you right there.
hmm
Don't worry. If you're using the apps, they'll tell you how many points it is there. You don't need to memorize. In fact, it will do all the math for you, which is even better. You don't even have to learn addition yourself. The app will add a lot up for you. So all right, you've picked your Duke. Now you go through this list. Walk us through going through this list. What are the decisions you're making as a player?
yeah. So first, there's always kind of an option for like the mundane magic weapons. If you're not going to be buying a magic weapon, then you can choose from the list here. We've got the Morning Star, the Great Weapon, and the Lance. Just so people know, the Great Weapon is a representation of like a great sword, a great axe, something of that nature. Um, like a
Now, I
D
don't
and
see
D
the
equivalent.
rules for them here, Evan. Where do I find the rules for these weapons? Because I
Yeah,
don't
so
see them listed.
these are going to be those main rulebook weapons. They're kind of in that
Okay.
midsection of the book where they go through the different weapon types and they'll break down what the stats are. And these are kind of your non magical weapon loadout options, the same kind of weapons that all of your units in the book will have.
So if you took a great weapon on your Duke and I took a great weapon on my vampire, would it be the same weapon effectively?
It's the same weapon, but it adds its
Yeah,
stats to a different profile. So the
a
vampire
different
might
profile.
be. Actually, the vampire has very similar weapon skill and strength to the Duke, so they would be pretty
Now,
similar.
would the points be the same though?
Not always. So you always need to look at your own book's specific points values. Sometimes there's reasons for certain weapons or items to be cost different amounts. For example, a great weapon that's wielded by an elf can
Mm-hmm.
counteract a lot of the downsides of that strikes last from the great weapon. So it may cost more points than if you give it to a duke, for example.
There you go. So there are some core equipment things, both mundane, which means non-magical, weapons and armor. They're in the core rule book because all armies will have access to these, and so it will just reference them, which is why the rules aren't listed here. That will also be true for some core magic items. Each army has army-specific magic items, weapon, talisman, etc. We're not going to go all of them here. They'll be listed in this army book, but then there are general core magic items that any army can pull from that general bucket as well. So that's why you'll see that those general anybody can take it, and it's the same rules. This magic item, is the same magic item if I take it in my vampire army or Evan takes it on his Bretonian army. It's the same thing. The points would be the same for the magic items, but on the mundane items, the points will be different for every unit entry. So make sure you read it, which is why I listed out here. For Evan's Duke, It's saying that great weapon is 4 points. It might be 6 points. It might be 2 points for my vampire. You need to look at the entry, and it will tell you right here what it costs. All right. So what do you? Why are you choosing one weapon over another, Evan?
Well, basically, different weapons are just going to give you different stat changes. So a Morning Star, it only requires one hand, and so it's the kind of option you might go for if you wanted a weapon that you can just fight with in one hand and not require two hands, like the Great Weapon does, for example. The Great Weapon
Mm-hmm.
requiring two hands also gives you strikes last, so that will then slow you down, and maybe you get killed before that guy gets to make his attack, right? And then
There's
the
pros and
lance,
cons to each one of these
yeah,
weapons. It sounds
precisely. And the lance, it only gives you a benefit essentially when you're charging. So if you're a character walking around on foot, then lance doesn't really. You're not even allowed to buy it actually, because that'd be very
right.
silly.
You have to be problematic. Cool. All right. So I pick out your Duke. You started at 100 or 175. I'm going to choose what kind of mundane weapons or armor I want to equip to him, and it will tell me they're
Yeah.
listed here. But then it has this nightly vow thing. What's that all about?
So some characters have bonuses that they can buy that are on top of magic item allotment, and these
Cool.
bonuses are almost always very very juicy. So a nightly vow, is oh right, no, these are the vows you're talking about. Questing vow or Grail vow, right? So
Hmm.
there are many characters who have bonuses like this where they will give them some benefit, and these are special rules that you'll find in the I think it's the end of the army list construction that it'll talk
Yeah,
about what the
but
different
you'll
vows
find
do.
it in this book,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
in this book.
it's typical for characters to have special rule upgrades. These are special rule upgrades, and they will be found in in this book, this army composition, because they're not for all the armies. They're specific to this army. So we're not going to go through what they mean here, but
Yeah,
that's what those are, and it tells you what the points cost for those are. And then it lists out a few of those. But then it gets down to magic item allotment. So explain to us what that means, and why do I see three different values there?
yeah. So it's very common. I think every character in the game that has different tiers. The highest level tier characters get to have more allotment to spend on items. Now these items are magical weapons, suits of magical armor. There's talismans that will help protect you. It's very similar to kind of like an RPG where you buy the items. Now, one thing to be
Mm-hmm.
very aware of is that when you buy a weapon, you can't use a mundane weapon at the same time. This is
Mm.
something that a lot of people get wrong. They will buy a lance and then also buy a magic sword for some reason, and you are not allowed to use your mundane weapon if you are equipped with a magical one.
Yep. And
Yeah,
again, we're not going to go through all those rules,
yeah.
but you should check them in the rule book. But there I also see 3 points values there. Why
Yeah,
do I see 3 points values?
yeah, so the Duke is able to take the largest number of points, so he can have 100 points. Then the Baron has 75, and the Paladin has 50. So if you have, for example, I suggested earlier for an intro game, if your general was the Baron, he would only get a magic item total allotment of 75 points to spend on, let's
Mm.
say, the magic sword and some armor to help protect him. Whereas the Duke might have enough points to spend on a sword, the armor, and maybe a third item. I think on average, a lot of these items cost around 30 points. So a paladin often has one item, maybe two. The baron might have two good items, and the duke might have even three good items. And this helps to kind of magnify how powerful they are on the battlefield. And it also increases their total points count. So if you spend all 100 points on the magic items for your duke, he's going to go from 175 to 275.
Hmm. Absolutely. There we go. And then also, it does say, it doesn't list out the points here, but it does say maybe mounted. It says see page 89. We're not going to go to it, but it's a similar concept that if you want to put him on a mount, and it will list out here are the mounts that this character can be on. It can be on a horse or a Pegasus or a dragon or whatever that army can take. It will tell you in those sections. Effectively, you just take here's what the character cost, in this case the Duke, and then you add up all the different upgrades that you give him, and then that's your total of that's how many points this character cost. And you need to be cognizant of there are his individual restrictions listed out here, but then again, back to we said a 2,000 point game. There were restrictions above. I could only spend 50% of my points on the Bretonian army on characters. So that means I have 1,000 points to spend on total at most. You might not want to spend 1,000 points on characters in this particular game, so you need to figure it out and get out there. But again, the best way to learn is to play. And I promise you one thing, Evan: every single person, even veterans, make mistakes when creating their roster, even before they play the game. Don't stress about it. Don't overthink it. Don't worry. Everybody makes mistakes. The community is there to help you. And again, I encourage you to reach out to your local community, reach out to your friends. Feel free to join our Discord again, reach out to us. There's so many amazing people out there who will help walk you through the process because they want you to play a game with them. They want to play Old World together, so they want to get to help you get an army on the battlefield and such. So that's kind of a general overview. Any other big topics you think we should go over? This ended up being a little bit longer than I thought, but I thought it was kind of important. We went through some of the
It is very
basics.
important. I just think it's good for people to understand that it says your paladin starts at 60 points, but a typical paladin build will often be around like 130, 150 points. So if your paladin ends up costing that many points, it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It just means that your upgrades are often more than that base value.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
a baron might be 250 points, and a duke might be 350 points, and that's just once you buy the things you want to buy, you just end up costing a lot more than that starting ticket.
Yeah, and I think at the high end, I think the most expensive character in the game, kitted out, is a Chaos Lord on a dragon with all the kits and all the demon buffs and gear. Can he break 600? I think he could break
He can
600
break
points.
600 points. I don't think he breaks 700. I think he's around
Yeah,
640.
but that's a lot of points for a single model. Now, it's a very powerful model, but it's a lot of points. And again, there's pros and cons to that. All right, cool. So I think that's going to wrap up this segment in terms of the basics of, all right, made some models. Now you need to build your army list. We walked you through the basics there. And again, just start diving in. Use those apps. They're super helpful. They'll even tell you some of the errors when building it wrong, like, oh, you spent too many points here, or you didn't spend enough here. Again, I encourage you to check them out. They're fantastic. And we will, as always, continue our series onboarding players into the game. And we're looking forward to seeing you out there on the battlefield.
Absolutely. We welcome you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.